The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper, the kind my stepmother Patricia always used when she wanted to remind everyone how refined she thought she was. Family dinner at Riverside Manor, it read in her perfect cursive. Celebrating Dad's retirement. Dress appropriately. The last part was underlined twice as if she knew I'd show up in my usual jeans and button-down shirt. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I should have thrown it away. Should have made an excuse like I had for the last 3 family gatherings. But something about the word retirement pulled at me. Maybe it was the hope that after 35 years of running his accounting firm, Dad might finally have time to see me as more than just the disappointment who chose military service over business school. Riverside Manor sat on the edge of town like a monument to everything I'd never quite fit into. The parking lot was full of luxury cars, my half-brother Marcus's BMW, my stepsister Jennifer's Mercedes, Uncle Robert's Porsche. I pulled my 10-year-old Honda Civic into a spot between 2 Range Rovers and tried not to think about how it looked like a toy car surrounded by giants. The hostess greeted me with the kind of smile reserved for people who clearly didn't belong. "Table for one?" she asked, her eyes scanning my simple khaki pants and navy polo shirt. "I'm meeting the Harrison party," I said, straightening my shoulders the way I'd learned to do when addressing commanding officers. "Oh," her expression shifted to something between confusion and pity. "Right this way, sir." The dining room was all warm wood and soft lighting, the kind of place where appetizers cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. I spotted my family immediately. They commanded the corner table like they owned the place. Dad sat at the head, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Patricia flanked his right side, her diamond earrings catching the light every time she moved her head. Marcus and Jennifer sat across from each other, both scrolling through their phones with the casual arrogance of people who'd never had to worry about anything more serious than which vacation home to visit. The empty chair waiting for me was positioned slightly apart from the others, close enough to be included but far enough to feel separate. I'd occupied that chair at every family gathering for the past 15 years. Ever since Dad remarried and inherited Patricia's 2 perfect children, who actually wanted to follow in his footsteps. "Jay!" Dad's voice boomed across the room as I approached, loud enough for nearby tables to turn and look. "There's our soldier boy. Glad you could make it." Soldier boy. At 32 years old, with 2 combat deployments and a chest full of medals locked away in a storage unit, I was still a soldier boy to him. Not son, not Jake. Just a diminutive reminder of the choice that had disappointed him most. Patricia air-kissed my cheek, her perfume sharp and expensive. "You look tired, honey. Are you eating enough?" The concern in her voice was as thin as tissue paper, more performance than genuine care. I took my seat and noticed the single menu placed in front of me, while everyone else already had their orders taken. The server, a young man with nervous energy, hurried over with a leather-bound wine list. "Something to drink, sir?" he asked. Before I could answer, Marcus laughed from across the table. "Better stick to water, Tommy. This isn't exactly government per diem pricing." My name was Jake, not Tommy, but Marcus had been calling me that for years, a play on the military term for common soldier. Everyone at the table chuckled like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all day. "I'll have the house red," I said quietly, ignoring the exchange. "The house red is $43 a glass." The server warned gently. The table fell silent. I felt their eyes on me, waiting to see if I'd back down, if I'd prove once again that I didn't belong in their world of casual, expensive gestures. "That's fine," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. Dad cleared his throat. "Actually, son, why don't you let me handle the wine selection tonight? This is supposed to be a celebration." Jennifer looked up from her phone for the first time since I'd arrived. "Speaking of celebrations, did you hear about my promotion?" "Regional Marketing Director for the entire West Coast Division." She practically glowed with pride. "Dad says it's the youngest anyone's ever been promoted to that level in the company." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Patricia beamed, reaching over to squeeze Jennifer's hand. Robert was telling me how impressed all the senior partners are with your work. Uncle Robert, Dad's business partner, nodded approvingly. Jennifer's got a real head for business, takes after her old man. He winked at Dad, who smiled with the kind of paternal pride I'd spent my whole life trying to earn. What about you, Marcus? Dad asked. How's the new position treating you? Marcus straightened in his chair, clearly relishing the attention. It's incredible, Dad. Managing the entire commercial real estate portfolio for the firm. We just closed a deal that'll bring in over $2 million in revenue this year alone. $2 million, Dad repeated, shaking his head in admiration. When I started this business, I never dreamed we'd see numbers like that. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They talked about quarterly reports and client dinners, about vacation homes and investment opportunities, about a world I'd never been invited to join. Every few minutes, someone would glance my way with a polite smile, but no one asked about my life, my work, my anything. The appetizers arrived, some kind of seafood tower that probably cost more than my car payment. Patricia served everyone with the practiced grace of someone who'd hosted 1,000 dinners like this one. My portion was noticeably smaller than the others, but I didn't comment. So Jake, Uncle Robert said, finally addressing me, directly, still working at that security company downtown. Private consulting, I corrected. Risk assessment, and strategic planning. Right, he nodded like he was humoring a child. It must be nice to have such flexible hours, not like the corporate world where you're expected to be available 24/7. Flexible hours, as if the 60-hour weeks I'd been pulling meant I was somehow less committed, less serious about my work than they were about theirs. Actually, the hours can be pretty demanding. I said. My last client project required round-the-clock security analysis for a major. Oh, that reminds me, Jennifer interrupted, not even looking up from her phone. Did you guys see the article about Dad in the Business Journal? They called him one of the most influential financial advisors in the state. And just like that, the conversation shifted away from me again. Dad basked in the praise while Patricia detailed every word of the article as if she'd written it herself. Marcus added his own thoughts about the business world's recognition of their family's success, and Jennifer nodded along while typing furiously on her phone. The main course arrived, and with it came the wine Dad had selected, a bottle that cost more than I used to make in a day during my first deployment. He made a show of tasting it, swirling it in his glass and nodding approvingly at the server. Excellent choice, Mr. Harrison, the server said. Should I pour for everyone? Everyone except Jake, Dad said with a casual wave of his hand. He's more of a beer guy. Isn't that right, son? I wasn't more of a beer guy. I developed an appreciation for wine during my years stationed overseas, and had even taken a sommelier course during my leave time in Italy. But explaining that would have required them to listen, to see me as something more than the one-dimensional version of myself they'd constructed in their minds. Wine's fine, I said simply. Dad looked momentarily confused, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Really, since when? Since always, I said, accepting the glass the server poured for me. I just don't talk about it much. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Patricia jumped in with forced brightness. Well, isn't that nice? Jake's developing sophisticated taste. The way she said it made it sound like I was a child who'd just learned to tie his shoes. I took a sip of the wine. It was good. A Bordeaux with notes of blackberry and tobacco, and said nothing. You know, Marcus said, cutting into his steak, I was thinking about our family legacy the other day. 3 generations of Harrisons in business, all of us carrying on the tradition. Well, most of us anyway. He didn't look at me when he said it, but everyone knew who he meant. I was the deviation, the family member who'd chosen service over profit, duty over dividends. It's funny how things work out, Patricia added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Some people are just built for different things. There's no shame in that. No shame in, as if my choice to serve my country was something to be pitied rather than respected, as if the years I'd spent in places they couldn't pronounce, doing things they'd never have the courage to do, was somehow lesser than their comfortable lives built on inherited connections and nepotism. The conversation continued, but I'd stopped listening. I focused on my meal, on the weight of the wine glass in my hand, on anything except the growing realization that I'd been fooling myself for years. This wasn't my family. These people who shared my last name, who'd known me since I was 17, who'd watched me grow from a confused teenager into a man, they saw me as nothing more than an obligation, a reminder of the son Dad had lost when I chose my own path instead of his. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. When the check arrived, Dad reached for it with the practiced ease of someone who'd never had to worry about money. He glanced at the total and nodded approvingly, as if the $300 dinner was pocket change. "This was lovely," Patricia said, dabbing at her lips with her napkin. "We should do this more often." "Absolutely," Jennifer agreed. "Though next time maybe we should try that new place downtown. The one with the Michelin star." "Oh, but that might be a bit much for some of us," Marcus said, his eyes flicking toward me with barely concealed amusement. "We wouldn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable." That was it. The final straw. Not the condescending comments or the casual dismissal of my career, but the assumption that I couldn't handle their world, that I was somehow less than them because I'd chosen service over profit. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Every eye at the table turned to me, surprise written across their faces as if they'd forgotten I was there. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice calm and steady. It was illuminating. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Jake," Patricia said with a nervous laugh. "We're just having fun. Family teasing, you know." "I know exactly what this is," I replied, pulling out my wallet to leave a tip for the server. "And I think I've had enough family teasing for one lifetime." Dad frowned. "Now hold on, son. Don't be so sensitive, we're celebrating here." "Celebrating? What, exactly?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Your retirement? Your success? Or the fact that you finally have an excuse to remind everyone at the table which one of your children is the disappointment?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Around us, other diners pretended not to notice the tension, but I could feel their curiosity like a physical weight. "Jake," Dad said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with employees who'd stepped out of line. "You're making a scene." "No," I said, placing a $20 bill on the table. "I'm making a choice. The same choice I made 15 years ago, when I decided to serve something bigger than myself." I turned to leave, but not before I caught sight of the server who'd been attending our table. He was standing near the kitchen entrance, watching the exchange with the kind of professional concern that comes from years of managing difficult situations. Our eyes met across the room, and something passed between us. A recognition, maybe, or just the shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated by people who thought they knew everything about you. I walked out of Riverside Manor that night with my head held high, not knowing that in exactly 2 weeks, I'd be walking back in under very different circumstances. Not knowing that the respect I'd been searching for in all the wrong places was about to find me in the most unexpected way possible. But that's a story for another part of this journey, one that would change everything I thought I knew about family, respect, and the true meaning of success. The rain started just as I reached my car, fat drops that matched the weight, settling in my chest. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, watching the lights of Riverside Manor blur through the windshield. Inside, my family was probably already moving on to dessert, the uncomfortable moment of my departure forgotten as quickly as everything else about me. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, Maria. "Colonel Phillips called. I want to discuss the Henderson Industries contract tomorrow morning. Says it's urgent." Henderson Industries. The defense contractor whose CEO had been personally recommended by someone high up the Pentagon chain. The kind of client that could transform my small consulting firm into something substantial. I'd been working on their security assessment for weeks, but Phillips had been vague about the details, only saying that discretion was paramount and that the right person for this job would understand the unique challenges of military to civilian transitions. I drove home through empty streets, my mind drifting between the humiliation of dinner and the possibilities that tomorrow might bring. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a converted warehouse downtown, the kind of place that prioritized function over form. No expensive art on the walls, no marble countertops, just clean lines and everything in its place. The only decoration was a single framed photo on my desk. My old unit standing in front of our base in Afghanistan, all of us squinting against the desert sun. That photo represented something my family would never understand. Brotherhood forged in impossible circumstances, trust built through shared sacrifice, respect earned through action, not inheritance. I poured myself a glass of the same wine Dad had dismissed earlier, a bottle I'd picked up during a weekend trip to Napa Valley, something I'd been saving for a special occasion. Tonight felt like the right time to open it. Not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. I was done trying to fit into spaces that weren't meant for me. The next morning, I arrived at Philip's office 30 minutes early, a habit ingrained from years of military punctuality. His secretary led me through a maze of glass corridors to a conference room where Phillips waited with two other men. I didn't recognize Thompson, Phillips said, standing to shake my hand. Glad you could make it. I'd like you to meet David Chen, Henderson Industries head of security, and Michael Rodriguez, their operations director. Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp attention that came from years of dealing with sensitive information. Rodriguez looked like he'd stepped out of a Fortune 500 boardroom, all polished confidence and expensive suits. We've been reviewing your preliminary assessment, Chen said, sliding a folder across the table. Your insights into potential vulnerabilities were comprehensive, more than comprehensive. Rodriguez added, they were the kind of observations that only come from someone who's actually been in the field, who understands how security threats evolve in real time. I opened the folder and felt my breath catch. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Classified reports, strategic assessments, correspondence with my signature on the bottom, but not Jake Thompson's signature. These were signed by someone with a very different title. There seems to be some confusion, I said carefully. These documents are exactly why we need you, Phillips interrupted. Jake, we've been authorized to discuss something that's been classified up until now. The Henderson Industries contract isn't just about corporate security. It's about establishing a new model for defense consulting, one that bridges the gap between active military intelligence and private sector needs. Chen leaned forward. The Pentagon has been looking for someone with your specific background, someone who understands both worlds, military operations and civilian applications, someone who's proven they can operate independently while maintaining the highest levels of security clearance. My mind raced. The security clearance they were talking about wasn't something I'd listed on my resume. It was tied to operations that officially didn't exist, to a period of my military service that I'd never discussed with anyone outside the chain of command. How do you know about? General Morrison sends his regards, Rodriguez said quietly. He mentioned you might be surprised to hear from us. Said you'd probably downplay your qualification. General Morrison. My former commanding officer, the man who'd recommended me for assignments that required a level of strategic thinking most people assumed I didn't possess. The same man who'd told me during my final debrief that my real value wouldn't be recognized until I was ready to step into a different kind of leadership role. The Henderson contract is just the beginning. Phillips continued, we're talking about establishing a new division within the company, one that specializes in high-level strategic consulting for defense contractors. You wouldn't just be an employee, Jake. You'd be a founding partner. Partnership. The word hung in the air like a challenge, not the kind my family understood, built on connections and inherited advantages, but something earned through competence and trust. What exactly would this partnership entail? I asked. Chen pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker, full operational control over the security consulting division. Your own team, your own budget, your own decision-making authority. The initial contract is worth 8 figures, with expansion potential based on performance. 8 figures. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, something shifted. Not just the money, though that was substantial, but the recognition, the acknowledgement that my skills had value beyond what I'd been settling for. "There's one more thing," Rodriguez said. "The position would require you to interface with military leadership on a regular basis. Joint Chiefs, Pentagon officials, NATO commanders. You'd be representing Henderson Industries at the highest levels of defense planning." I thought about my family, sitting around that table last night, dismissing my career as glorified security work. They had no idea that my flexible hours were spent analyzing threats to national security, that my government contracts involved briefing officials whose names they'd recognize from the evening news. "I'm interested," I said. "When would this start?" "Immediately," Phillips replied. "We'd like to announce the partnership next week. There's going to be a formal ceremony, military honors, the works. Henderson Industries believes in recognizing the caliber of people they're bringing on board." Military honors. The phrase resonated in a way that surprised me, not because I needed the recognition, but because it represented something I'd thought was left behind when I'd transitioned to civilian life. "One question," I said. "This ceremony, would it be open to the public? Family members, that sort of thing?" "Absolutely," Rodriguez smiled. "In fact, Henderson Industries encourages family participation. They believe in celebrating achievements with the people who matter most." The people who matter most. For the first time in years, I realized I might have been looking for those people in all the wrong places. "Before I give you my final answer," I said, standing to shake their hands, "I need to ask a favor. There's a restaurant downtown called Riverside Manor. I'd like to host a small family dinner there in 2 weeks. Would Henderson Industries be willing to cover the expense as part of the partnership celebration?" Phillips looked puzzled. "Of course, but I'm sure we could arrange something more substantial. A private club, perhaps." "Riverside Manor is perfect," I said. "Trust me on this one." As I left the building, my phone rang. Maria again, her voice excited. "Jake, you're not going to believe this. Someone from the Department of Defense called. They want to discuss a consulting contract for next month. Something about strategic planning for overseas operations." Department of Defense. The same organization my family thought I'd simply worked for during my military service, as if I'd been filing paperwork in some basement office, rather than making decisions that affected operations across 3 continents. "Set up the meeting," I said. "And Maria, start putting together a press release. We're going to need to announce some significant changes to the company structure." "Changes? What kind of changes?" I smiled as I walked to my car. "The kind that requires a much bigger office." That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and a legal pad, sketching out the organizational structure for what would become Thomson Strategic Consulting. Not just a one-man operation taking whatever contracts came my way, but a legitimate firm with the resources and recognition to compete at the highest levels. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had spent years trying to convince me that I'd made the wrong choice, that I'd given up security and prestige for a life of uncertain prospects. They'd measured my worth in terms they understood: salary, status, the kind of success that looked good on Christmas cards. But they'd never understood that some achievements can't be measured in dollars, that some recognition comes from sources they'd never even considered. They'd never asked about the commendations locked away in my storage unit, the recommendations that had followed me into civilian life, the network of contacts who knew my real value even when I'd forgotten it myself. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Daniel Morrison. Heard you're finally ready to stop hiding your light under a bushel. About time, soldier. The country needs people like you in positions where you can make a real difference." General Morrison. Even in retirement, he was keeping track of the people who'd served under his command, making sure they found their way to where they belonged. I raised my glass to the empty room, to the photo of my unit, to the future I was just beginning to understand. In 2 weeks, I'd be sitting at that same table in Riverside Manor, but everything else would be different, not just my circumstances, but my understanding of what family really meant and where respect actually came from. The best part? They had no idea what was coming. The Henderson Industries ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning, at the Pentagon's river entrance, with more media attention than I'd expected. News crews lined the steps as government officials and defense contractors filed past, their badges glinting in the autumn sunlight. I stood in the reception area, adjusting the collar of my dress uniform, the same one I'd worn during my final military ceremony 5 years ago, now pressed and fitted for a very different kind of recognition. General Thompson? A young reporter approached with a microphone. Rachel Martinez, from Defense Weekly. Could you comment on the significance of this new partnership between Henderson Industries and military intelligence? General Thompson. The title still felt surreal, even though the promotion had been retroactively applied based on classified operations that were only now being acknowledged. My family would probably see the news coverage and assume it was some kind of mistake. A case of mistaken identity involving someone who shared my name. The partnership represents a new model for defense consulting, I said, keeping my response measured. It's about ensuring that the transition from military service to civilian leadership maintains the highest standards of strategic excellence. In your role specifically, our sources indicate you'll be overseeing a 9-figure budget for defense contractors across multiple theaters of operation. 9 figures. The number had grown since my initial meeting with Phillips, expanding as more Pentagon officials learned about the program and requested to be included. What had started as a single contract had evolved into something resembling a small government agency, with me at the center of it all. I'm honored to serve in whatever capacity best supports our national security interests, I replied, the diplomatic language coming naturally after years of military briefings. The ceremony itself was brief but significant. Secretary of Defense Williams spoke about the importance of leveraging experienced military leadership in civilian consulting roles. General Morrison, now retired but still influential, presented me with a commendation for distinguished service in establishing new paradigms for defense industry collaboration. The handshake we shared lasted longer than protocol required, his eyes conveying the pride that my own father had never shown. Afterwards, during the reception, I found myself surrounded by people whose names I'd only seen in classified briefings. Senators, defense contractors, joint chiefs of staff, all of them treating me not as an obligation or disappointment, but as someone whose opinions carried weight. Jake? Phillips appeared at my elbow with a champagne flute. There's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Admiral Rebecca Foster, head of Naval Intelligence. She's been following your work for some time. Admiral Foster was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. General Thompson, she said, extending her hand. I've read your strategic assessments, impressive work, particularly your analysis of supply chain vulnerabilities in Eastern European operations. Eastern European operations. She was referring to classified work I'd done during my final year of active duty. Recommendations that had influenced NATO positioning in ways the public would never know about. Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate the feedback. I have a proposition for you, she continued. Naval Intelligence is looking for someone to head a new civilian advisory board. The position would require Senate confirmation, but given your background and the current political climate, that shouldn't be an issue. Senate confirmation. A position that would require congressional approval, the kind of role typically reserved for former cabinet members or retired 4-star generals. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from Maria. Your family called the office. They saw the news coverage. Want to know if you're available for lunch this week. Lunch. Not dinner, not a family gathering, but a casual lunch, the kind of meeting you have with acquaintances rather than relatives. They'd probably seen my name in the headlines and were suddenly interested in reconnecting, though they'd likely spend the entire meal trying to figure out how the Jake they knew had become the General Thompson making national news. If you'll excuse me, I said to Admiral Foster, I need to make a quick call. I stepped into a quiet corner and dialed Maria's number. What exactly did they say? Your stepmother called. She was very enthusiastic. Keep asking about your schedule and whether you'd be free for family celebrations. She mentioned something about your father being proud and wanting to plan something special. Proud? After 32 years of disappointment and dismissal, he was suddenly proud. Not because of who I'd become as a person, but because my success was now visible in terms he could understand and brag about to his friends. Set up a dinner reservation for this Friday, I said. Riverside Manor, 7 o'clock. Party of 6. Should I mention that Henderson Industries will be covering the expense? No, I said, thinking about the conversation I'd had with the restaurant's management earlier that week. Just make the reservation under my name, and Maria, make sure to use my full title when you call. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Defense contractors who'd never returned my messages were suddenly eager to discuss partnerships. Media outlets wanted interviews about the new model of military-civilian collaboration. My small office downtown was already too cramped for the staff I'd need to hire, and commercial real estate agents were calling with listings for entire floors and buildings I'd never dreamed of affording. But the most interesting call came Thursday evening, just as I was finishing dinner in my apartment. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. General Thompson, this is James Mitchell from Riverside Manor. I wanted to personally confirm your reservation for tomorrow evening and discuss some special arrangements. Special arrangements? Well, sir, when we received the reservation under your name, our staff did some research. We discovered your recent Pentagon ceremony and wanted to ensure your dining experience reflects the appropriate level of service. We've prepared our private dining room, the one typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. The private dining room. The same space where my family would have laughed 2 weeks ago at the suggestion that I belonged anywhere near it. That's very kind, but the main dining room will be fine. I'd prefer my guests to see me in the same context as our last visit. Of course, sir. And General, our entire staff has been briefed on the situation. We're honored to serve you and your family. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I dressed carefully, not in my uniform, which would have been too obvious, but in a tailored charcoal suit I'd purchased specifically for this occasion, the kind of suit that spoke quietly about success rather than shouting about it. My phone had been buzzing all day with congratulatory messages from colleagues and former military contacts who'd seen the continued news coverage of my appointment. The story had legs, as they said in media circles, because it represented something larger than a single promotion. It was about recognizing the value of military experience in civilian leadership roles. I arrived at Riverside Manor 15 minutes early, a habit that had served me well in military briefings and would serve me even better tonight. The same hostess who'd looked at me with pity 2 weeks ago now approached with professional deference. General Thompson, she said, her voice pitched lower than I remembered. Your table is ready. Would you prefer to be seated immediately or would you like to wait for your party in the lounge? I'll wait here, I said, positioning myself where I could see the entrance clearly. They arrived exactly at 7 o'clock, my family moving through the restaurant with the same entitled confidence they'd always displayed. Dad wore his best suit, the one he saved for important client dinners. Patricia had chosen a dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Marcus and Jennifer flanked them like bodyguards, both dressed as if they were attending a business merger rather than a family dinner. But something was different about their body language. Instead of the casual arrogance they'd displayed 2 weeks ago, there was a careful uncertainty, the way people move when they're not sure of the rules anymore. I watched them scan the dining room, looking for me among the other guests. When their eyes finally found me standing by the host station, their expressions shifted through a sequence of emotions: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been respected. Dad approached first, his hand extended in a formal handshake rather than the casual pat on the shoulder I was used to receiving. "Jake," he said, his voice carrying a weight it had never held when speaking to me. "Congratulations. We saw the news coverage. Very impressive." Impressive. Not disappointing, not concerning, but impressive. The change in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. This was how he spoke to important clients, to people whose opinions mattered to him. "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand with the same firm grip I'd used with the Secretary of Defense 3 days earlier. Patricia air-kissed my cheek with more genuine warmth than she'd ever shown, her eyes taking in details she'd never noticed before. The quality of my suit, the confidence in my posture, the way other diners glanced in our direction with curiosity rather than judgment. "We had no idea," she said softly. "The news said you're overseeing defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Marcus and Jennifer hung back slightly, their usual casual dismissiveness replaced by something resembling caution. They were recalculating, trying to reconcile the person they'd known with the man they'd seen on television shaking hands with Pentagon officials. "Shall we sit?" I suggested, gesturing toward our table. As we walked across the dining room, I noticed something that made me smile inwardly. Other guests were watching us now, but not with the mixture of pity and amusement they'd shown during my last visit. These looks carried speculation, curiosity about who I was, and why I commanded such obvious deference from the staff. We reached the table, the same corner spot where I'd occupied the isolated chair 2 weeks ago, but tonight, the seating arrangement had been subtly adjusted. Instead of placing me at the periphery, the restaurant had positioned chairs to create a more equal distribution, with no single person obviously relegated to the edge. As we settled into our seats, I noticed the server approaching, the same young man who'd witnessed my humiliation during the last family dinner. Our eyes met across the room, and he moved toward our table with the measured steps of someone who understood that everything was about to change. The moment I'd been planning for 2 weeks was finally here. The server approached our table with a silver wine list, but this time his demeanor was entirely different. Instead of the nervous uncertainty he'd displayed 2 weeks ago, he moved with professional confidence, his posture reflecting the kind of respect typically reserved for VIP guests. "Good evening," he said, addressing the table collectively before turning to me. "General Thompson, welcome back to Riverside Manor. We're honored to have you dining with us again." The silence that followed was absolute. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Patricia's wine glass hovered suspended in the air. Marcus actually looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from casual indifference to sharp attention. "Thank you, David," I said, reading his name tag with the same casual familiarity I'd use with longtime staff. "I trust you've been well since our last conversation." David nodded respectfully. "Very well, sir, and congratulations on your recent appointment. The entire staff has been following the news coverage. We're all very proud to serve someone of your caliber." I could feel my family's eyes boring into me, their confusion palpable. Jennifer was the first to break, her voice pitched higher than usual. "I'm sorry, did he just call you General?" "General Thompson," David confirmed, his tone carrying the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating an obvious truth. The Pentagon ceremony was quite impressive. We have the news coverage playing in our staff break room. Dad cleared his throat, his businessman's instincts kicking in, even as his personal understanding of the situation lagged behind. "I think there might be some confusion here. This is my son, Jake. He works in security consulting." David's eyebrows rose slightly, the kind of polite surprise that comes from correcting an important guest without causing offense. "With respect, sir, General Thompson heads the new Defense Strategic Consulting Division for Henderson Industries. His recent appointment involves overseeing military contractor relationships across multiple theaters of operation." The explanation hung in the air, like smoke. I watched my family process this information, their minds working to reconcile the Jake they thought they knew with the General Thompson that apparently existed in newspapers and Pentagon press releases. "Multiple theaters of operation," Marcus repeated slowly, as if testing the words for authenticity. "The General's work has been featured in Defense Weekly, Military Times, and the Washington Post." David continued, clearly enjoying his role as informal spokesperson. "Just this week, he was recommended for a Senate-confirmed position with Naval Intelligence." Patricia set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "Senate-confirmed? The position requires congressional approval," I explained calmly. "It's fairly standard for senior defense positions. Fairly standard." As if briefing senators and overseeing nine-figure budgets was something I did every Tuesday, the understatement was intentional. After years of their casual dismissal, I wanted them to understand that my world was much larger than they'd ever imagined. David produced the wine list with a flourish. "General, Would you prefer to select tonight's wine? Or would you like me to recommend something from our reserve collection? Reserve collection. The bottles they kept for heads of state and Fortune 500 CEOs, the kind of wine that cost more per glass than I used to make in a week. Surprise me, I said. Something appropriate for a celebration. Excellent choice, sir. I'll return with something special. As David walked away, the table remained silent. Dad was staring at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. Jennifer had put her phone down completely, her attention fully focused for perhaps the first time in years. Marcus looked like he was trying to solve a complicated equation in his head. I don't understand, Patricia finally said. 2 weeks ago, you thought I was a failure, I finished for her. Someone who'd thrown away his potential for a dead-end career in government work. The directness of my statement hit them like cold water. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual authoritative demeanor replaced by something resembling uncertainty. We never said failure, he protested weakly. You didn't have to say it, I replied. It was in every conversation we've had for the past 5 years. Every family gathering where you introduced me as your son, who chose a different path. Every time you assume I couldn't afford to eat at places like this. Jennifer found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. But the news said you're overseeing hundreds of millions in defense contracts. How is that even possible? I leaned back in my chair, choosing my words carefully. The consulting work you all dismissed as a side project involved strategic planning for NATO operations, threat assessment for joint military exercises, and security analysis for defense contractors working in classified theaters. The flexible hours you mocked were spent briefing Pentagon officials and reviewing intelligence reports that most civilians will never know exist. Intelligence reports. Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the words. My security clearance level has been classified since I left active duty, I continued. The operations I was involved in during my military service are just now being declassified, which is why the Pentagon was able to formally recognize my contributions and offer me the Henderson Industries position. David returned with a bottle that looked older than I was, its label bearing French text and a vintage date from the 1980s. He presented it to me with the kind of reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. Chateau Margaux 1982, he announced. From our private reserve, compliments of management. With their congratulations on your recent appointment. Compliments of management. The restaurant was giving me a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people's car payments, simply because of who I was and what I represented. That's very generous, I said, nodding approval for him to open it. As David worked the cork free, Dad finally found his voice again. Jake, I had no idea. If you'd known what? I interrupted. If you'd known I was successful in terms you could understand, if you'd known my work was getting national recognition, if you'd known I was making more money than all of you combined, the last part wasn't strictly true yet, but it would be within 6 months. More importantly, it was the kind of statement that would resonate with people who measured worth in financial terms. Patricia's face had gone pale. We're your family, Jake. We've always been proud of you. No, I said quietly, accepting a glass of the wine from David. You've always been embarrassed by me. Proud of Marcus for following Dad into the business. Proud of Jennifer for her marketing success. But embarrassed by the son who chose service over profit. The wine was extraordinary, complex, elegant, with layers of flavor that spoke to decades of careful aging. I savored it while my family struggled with the implications of what they were learning. The Henderson Industries position comes with equity, I continued conversationally. Based on projected growth, my stake should be worth somewhere in the 8-figure range within 2 years. The naval intelligence position, if I accept it, would make me one of the youngest senior advisors in the department's history. 8 figures. The number landed on the table like a physical object. Uncle Robert's accounting firm, the business they were all so proud of, probably didn't generate that much revenue in a decade. Jennifer was shaking her head slowly. This is insane. 2 weeks ago, you were Jake. I was always General Thompson, I corrected. You just never bothered to ask the right questions. You assumed that because you didn't understand my career, it must not be important. You measured my worth by your standards instead of trying to understand what I was actually accomplishing. Marcus leaned forward, his business instincts finally overriding his personal confusion. The news coverage mentioned strategic consulting. What exactly does that involve? I smiled, recognizing the tone. It was the same voice he used when discussing potential clients with Dad. The careful probing of someone trying to determine if a relationship might be professionally valuable. I provide threat assessment and strategic planning services to defense contractors operating in sensitive environments, I said. My recommendations influence everything from supply chain security to personnel deployment for operations that span multiple continents. Multiple continents, Dad repeated, his voice carrying a note of awe he'd never directed at me before. David appeared at my elbow again, this time carrying a small silver tray. General Thompson, I have a message for you from our general manager. He wanted to extend an invitation for you to join our VIP dining program. It includes priority reservations, complimentary wine selections, and access to our private event spaces. VIP dining program. The kind of membership my family had probably envied when they saw other guests being escorted to exclusive sections of the restaurant. Please extend my thanks to the general manager, I said. I'll certainly consider it. As David walked away, Patricia reached across the table and touched my hand. Jake, sweetheart, why didn't you tell us? All these years we had no idea you were doing such important work. I looked down at her hand on mine, noting the wedding ring that cost more than most people's annual salary, the manicured nails that had never known manual labor, the soft skin that had never experienced the calluses that came from real work. Because you never asked, I said simply. And because I knew you wouldn't understand the value of what I was doing until it was translated into terms you could recognize. The truth hung between us like a bridge. Neither side was quite ready to cross. They were beginning to understand that the son and brother they'd dismissed was someone entirely different from who they'd imagined, but they weren't quite ready to acknowledge what that meant about their own judgment, their own assumptions, their own failures as a family. The evening was far from over, and the most important revelations were yet to come. The appetizer course arrived with theatrical precision, caviar service on mother-of-pearl spoons, prepared tableside by the chef himself. This wasn't standard treatment for regular guests. It was the kind of attention reserved for heads of state and Fortune 500 executives. My family watched in stunned silence as the chef explained the provenance of each delicacy, directing his comments primarily to me while occasionally glancing at the others as if they were distinguished guests in my party. The ossetra is particularly exceptional tonight, General Thompson, the chef said, presenting the tray with obvious pride. Imported directly from our suppliers in France, I thought you might appreciate the quality. Dad's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his spoon. I could see him processing the implications, the level of service, the deference, the casual mention of international suppliers, as if discussing my preferences for imported caviar was a natural conversation topic. It's perfect, Chef Laurent, I replied, recognizing his name from the restaurant's website. Please extend my compliments to your team. As the chef departed, Jennifer broke the silence with a question that had clearly been building pressure in her mind. Jake? The military promotion, when did that happen? And why didn't we know about it? I set down my spoon and met her gaze directly. The promotion was retroactive, based on classified operations that were only recently declassified. Most of my military service involved assignments that officially didn't exist. The Pentagon ceremony last week was the first time I was allowed to discuss any of it publicly. Operations that didn't exist, Marcus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Counterintelligence, strategic planning for special operations, threat assessment for NATO allies operating in hostile territory. I explained matter-of-factly. The kind of work where success is measured by what doesn't happen rather than what does. Patricia leaned forward, her business instincts finally overriding her personal shock. And Henderson Industries recruited you specifically for this background? Henderson Industries was one of 3 defense contractors competing for my consultation, I corrected. The Pentagon recommended me to them, not the other way around. My expertise in transitioning classified military strategies to civilian defense applications made me valuable to multiple organizations. Multiple organizations. The implication that I'd been in demand, that companies had competed for my services, clearly resonated with people who understood market dynamics and professional value. Dad cleared his throat, falling back on the conversational patterns that had defined our relationship for years. Well, this is we're very proud of you, son. Very proud indeed. The words sounded hollow, performative. Pride offered retroactively. After success had been verified by external authorities, they respected more than their own judgment. Are you? I asked quietly. Or are you proud of the recognition? There's a difference. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dad's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his usual confidence deserting him when faced with a distinction he'd never been forced to consider. My phone vibrated with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Admiral Foster's direct line, a number that connected to one of the most secure communication networks in the U.S. military. "Excuse me," I said, answering with professional efficiency. "Admiral Foster. Jake, sorry to interrupt your evening, but we've got a situation developing overseas. I need your assessment on the Krasnoyarsk situation within the hour. Can you access secure channels from your current location?" Krasnoyarsk. A Russian city that most civilians couldn't locate on a map, but one that had been central to several classified operations I'd been involved in during my active duty. The fact that Admiral Foster was calling me directly for real-time strategic assessment spoke to a level of trust and responsibility my family had never imagined I possessed. "I can be back online in 30 minutes, I replied. "Are we looking at immediate deployment scenarios or longer-term strategic planning?" "Both. The Joint Chiefs are convening an emergency session at 200 hours. Your input will be essential for the final recommendations." Joint Chiefs, the highest level of military leadership in the country, and they were waiting for my analysis before making critical decisions that could affect international relations. "Understood. I'll have preliminary assessments ready within the hour." I ended the call and looked up to find my entire family staring at me with expressions ranging from bewilderment to something approaching awe. "Was that?" Jennifer's voice trailed off as if she couldn't quite form the question. "Admiral Foster, head of Naval Intelligence," I confirmed, sliding my phone back into my jacket pocket. "There's a developing situation that requires immediate strategic assessment. I'll need to cut our dinner short." The casual way I discussed being summoned by Navy admirals and briefing Joint Chiefs clearly exceeded their ability to process. This wasn't just success in terms they could understand, this was operating at levels of government they'd only seen in movies. Dad found his voice first, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Jake, I think we owe you an apology. We had no idea. We never understood." "You never tried to understand," I corrected, my tone remaining calm but firm. "For 5 years you assumed that because my work didn't fit your definition of success, it must be less valuable than yours. You measured my worth by how much I could afford to spend on dinner rather than asking what I was actually accomplishing." Patricia dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, her composure finally cracking. "We were wrong. We were so terribly wrong." "Yes, you were," I agreed without softening the statement. "But the wrongness wasn't in misunderstanding my career, it was in deciding that your understanding was the only one that mattered." Marcus leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "The things we said, the way we treated you, the way you treated me revealed who you are, not who I am," I said. "I've known my own worth for years. The difference is that now you know it too." David appeared at my elbow with impeccable timing, as if he'd been monitoring our conversation for the appropriate moment to intervene. "General Thompson, your car is ready whenever you need to depart. The manager wanted to ensure you wouldn't be delayed for your appointment." "My car?" They'd arranged transportation without being asked, the kind of service that spoke to a level of VIB treatment I'd never explicitly requested, but that they'd provided based solely on my reputation and position. "Thank you, David." Please charge everything to my account. Actually, sir, the meal has been complimentary. Management's way of honoring your service and celebrating your recent appointment. Complimentary. A dinner that would normally cost several $100s, provided free of charge because of who I was and what I represented. The gesture was both generous and strategic, the kind of relationship building that high-end establishments use to maintain connections with influential guests. I stood to leave, adjusting my jacket and checking my watch. I need to go. Duty calls, as they say. Jake, wait, Dad said, rising from his chair with obvious difficulty. Could we talk soon? Really talk, I mean, about everything. I studied his face for a moment, seeing something there I'd never noticed before, not just respect, but actual uncertainty. For the first time in our relationship, he was asking for my time, rather than granting me his. I'll have my assistant call you, I said. We can schedule something after I return from Washington. Washington? Jennifer asked. Pentagon briefings don't happen over the phone, I explained. I'll be spending the next few days in secure facilities, providing strategic recommendations to people whose decisions affect global security. The statement was matter-of-fact, but its implications were staggering. While they'd been worrying about quarterly profits and client dinners, I'd been operating at levels where my recommendations influenced international relations and military strategy. As I walked toward the exit, I noticed other diners watching my departure with curious interest. Word had spread through the restaurant staff about who I was, and the attention I was receiving clearly marked me as someone significant. The hostess who'd looked at me with pity 3 weeks ago now stood straighter as I passed, offering a respectful nod that acknowledged a status she'd never recognized before. Outside, a black sedan waited with government plates, and a driver who addressed me as General, without prompting. As we pulled away from Riverside Manor, I glanced back to see my family still seated at the table, probably trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the man who'd just been summoned to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff. My phone buzzed with a text from General Morrison. Heard you had dinner with the family tonight. How did that go? I smiled as I typed my response. Educational, for everyone involved. The real work was just beginning. Both the strategic assessment waiting for me in Washington and the more personal challenge of determining whether my family could evolve beyond the limitations they'd placed on themselves, and by extension on me. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, regardless of who did or didn't understand its value. 3 weeks later, I stood in the executive conference room of Thomson Strategic Consulting's new headquarters, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as workers installed our company logo on the building's facade. The 42nd floor offered a commanding view of the city, including the modest downtown office, where I'd started my consulting business 5 years ago with nothing but a laptop and a determination to prove my worth on my own terms. Maria knocked on the doorframe, holding a stack of messages and wearing the kind of smile that indicated good news. General Thompson? Senator Williams' office confirmed your hearing date for the Naval Intelligence position. Also, Defense Weekly wants to schedule a follow-up interview about the Henderson Industries expansion. The Naval Intelligence position required Senate confirmation, a process that would essentially make my professional achievements a matter of public record. Committee hearings broadcast on C-SPAN, testimony about my qualifications delivered under oath, background investigations that would reveal the full scope of my military service to anyone interested enough to read the transcripts. Schedule both, I said, signing the documents she'd prepared. And Maria. My father called yesterday asking about my availability for lunch. Set something up for next week. Since the dinner at Riverside Manor, Dad had been leaving voicemails with increasing frequency. Not the perfunctory calls he'd made in previous years, but genuine requests for conversation that carried a weight of regret and curiosity. The last message had included an admission I'd never expected to hear. Son, I realize I've spent 5 years not understanding who you really are. I'd like to change that, if you'll let me. My desk phone rang with an internal call from our new head of operations, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, recently retired from Army Intelligence, and one of 3 senior officers I'd recruited to handle our expanding client base. Jake, the British delegation is here for the NATO briefing. They're asking specifically about your analysis of Eastern European supply chain vulnerabilities. The NATO briefing. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to get return calls from mid-level defense contractors. Now I was providing strategic assessments to alliance commanders from 12 different countries. My recommendations, influencing military logistics across 3 continents. I'll be right down, I said, adjusting my tie and checking my reflection in the window. The man looking back at me bore little resemblance to the person who'd sat at the edge of that family dinner table, accepting their casual dismissal as if it reflected something true about my value. The elevator ride to our main conference room gave me a moment to consider how dramatically my circumstances had changed. Thomson Strategic Consulting now employed 47 people, including former military officers, intelligence analysts, and logistics specialists, whose combined expertise represented decades of high-level government service. Our client contracts spanned 4 time zones and generated revenue that exceeded my family's accounting firm by a factor of 10. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what mattered most. What mattered was the respect, not just from clients and colleagues, but from people whose opinions carried real weight in circles where decisions affected global security and international relations. The conference room buzzed with conversation in multiple languages as NATO representatives reviewed intelligence assessments and strategic recommendations I'd prepared over the past month. General Klaus Weber from German Strategic Command stood as I entered, extending his hand with the kind of formal recognition typically reserved for equals. "General Thompson," he said in accented but precise English, "your analysis of potential supply chain disruptions has proven invaluable to our planning committees. The recommendations you've provided may well prevent significant operational challenges in the coming months." As the briefing proceeded, I found myself at the center of conversations that would have been inconceivable just weeks earlier. Military commanders seeking my input on strategic decisions, intelligence officers deferring to my expertise on threat assessment, logistics coordinators implementing recommendations I'd developed based on classified operations most people would never know had occurred. During a break in the proceedings, my phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Saw your interview on CNN last night." Mom cried watching it. "She keeps saying she's proud of you." "We all are. Can we talk soon?" Mom, Patricia had never been Mom to me before. She'd always been Patricia, Dad's wife, the woman who'd inherited me along with his furniture and financial obligations. The shift in terminology suggested something deeper than mere recognition of my professional success. Colonel Mitchell approached with a tablet displaying real-time updates from various global monitoring systems. "Jake, we're getting requests from 3 additional NATO members for strategic assessments. The demand for our services is exceeding our current capacity." Exceeding capacity. The kind of problem most business owners dream of having, but one that carried additional complexities when the work involved classified information and international security relationships. "Draft a proposal for expanding our analyst team," I said. "Focus on recruiting from recently retired military intelligence. We need people who understand both the strategic implications and the security requirements." As the NATO briefing concluded and delegates began departing with promises to reconvene the following month, I realized that my phone had been buzzing consistently with incoming messages. Media requests, congressional staff scheduling meetings, defense contractors seeking consultation agreements, the kind of attention that comes from being recognized as essential rather than optional. The drive home took me past Riverside Manor, where a discreet sign now advertised their Distinguished Service Member Dining Program, a marketing initiative that had emerged following the publicity around my family dinner. The restaurant had contacted me personally to request permission to use my story as part of their promotional materials, offering lifetime VIP membership in exchange for the endorsement. My apartment felt different now, though nothing physical had changed. The same furniture, the same framed photo of my military unit, the same view of the city through modest windows, but the space now felt like a temporary arrangement, rather than a permanent residence, the kind of place someone occupied while transitioning to something larger and more appropriate to their circumstances. The evening news featured a segment about defense contractor relationships with former military personnel, using my appointment as an example of how specialized expertise was being leveraged in civilian consulting roles. The reporter mentioned my upcoming Senate hearing, describing it as a significant step toward recognizing the value of military strategic experience in contemporary security challenges. My phone rang with a call from General Morrison, whose voice carried the satisfaction of a mentor watching a protege exceed expectations. "Jake, I've been following your progress. Impressive work with the NATO assessments. The feedback I'm hearing from Pentagon leadership suggests you've exceeded even their optimistic projections." "Thank you, sir. The opportunity to apply military strategic thinking to civilian defense challenges has been remarkably fulfilling. There's something else," Morrison continued. "The Secretary of Defense has been asking about your availability for a special project. Something that would require Senate confirmation but would position you as one of the primary advisors for international defense cooperation." Secretary of Defense. Direct reporting to cabinet-level leadership, the kind of appointment that would make my name permanently associated with national security policy at the highest levels of government. "I'm honored by the consideration," I said. "When would this position begin?" "After your naval intelligence confirmation, assuming that proceeds as expected. The Secretary believes in building on success rather than starting from scratch." That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine, not the expensive reserve bottles that restaurants now offered me complimentarily, but a modest vintage I'd purchased because I enjoyed it rather than because it impressed anyone. The simplicity felt appropriate as I reviewed messages from family members who were slowly learning to see me as someone whose opinions and experiences might be worth understanding. Dad's message was the most thoughtful. "Son, I've been reading about your work in the business journals. I realize I spent years not appreciating what you were building. I'd like to learn more about your world, if you're willing to share it with someone who's finally ready to listen." The difference in tone was unmistakable. Not pride in reflected achievement, but genuine curiosity about my work and respect for my expertise. The kind of interest that might eventually grow into the relationship we'd never quite managed to develop. As I prepared for bed, I glanced once more at the photo of my military unit, remembering the conversation we'd had during our final deployment about what success would look like in civilian life. None of us had imagined it would involve briefing NATO commanders or advising cabinet-level officials. But all of us had understood that success meant earning respect through competence rather than inheritance. The family dinner at Riverside Manor felt like it had happened years ago rather than weeks. Not because the memory had faded, but because the person who'd sat at that table absorbing their casual dismissal had evolved into someone who operated at levels they were only beginning to comprehend. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that respect isn't inherited or purchased, but earned through dedication to something larger than personal comfort. And for the first time in years, I looked forward to explaining to my family exactly what that meant, knowing they were finally ready to understand the answer. The journey from disappointment to recognition had been longer than I'd expected, but shorter than it might have been. And the best part was knowing that everything I'd achieved had been built on my own terms, using skills they'd never valued until the world forced them to recognize their worth. The waiter had called me General Thompson, but I'd been earning that title long before anyone at that table was willing to acknowledge it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.